Ladies and gentlemen, shall we put our hands together to welcome Dr. Harsh to deliver the oration.
Dr. Philip Nainen, Dr. John Peter, Ms. Usha Jesudasan, Dr. Anna Pulimud, and all those who have gathered here who carry the torch of life which Dr. Ida Scudder handed to each of you, including my very, very beloved friend, Dr. Banayak Sen. It's an enormous privilege to stand here in memory of Dr. Ida Scudder, the incredible example of public service and what I call public compassion that she demonstrated. And to stand here in CMC, the Christian Medical College here, to my mind, represents surely the finest example within India and among the finest in the world of what an institution committed to public service, for service delivered to the most disadvantaged, always with respect, with dignity, and with kindness. And therefore, I could not have chosen an honor greater than being invited here to speak today. It's a privilege to which I am completely unequal, but here I am. We are living in extremely troubled times around the world and in India. And I will argue that the example of public compassion which both Dr. Ida Scudder and CMC Vellore provide really represent to me the core, the missing link that I speak of in finding a way out of the darkness of our times. But before I proceed, a word about a very strange bond that I have shared through all of my adult life and a little bit of my adolescence with CMC, with Dr. Scudder, with Dr. Paul Brand and others. I recall that I was 10 years old, studying in Mount Hermon School in Darjeeling, and for some reason, the story of Father Damien touched me and stayed with me all my life. I remember the first play I wrote was actually about Father Damien when I was 10 years old. Father Damien, many of you would know, was somebody who, it was a time when there was no cure for leprosy, and patients of leprosy were, in a sense, exiled to an island called Molokai and forgotten. And Father Damien decided at a young age that he would go and work among them. And his story was that in the initial years that he worked there, he obviously took care that he should not get the infection, and he talked to them from a distance, and he didn't make an impact. And then he realized that the only way that he could actually change the hell in which the leprosy patients in Molokai lived was to forget about the fears of getting infected himself and to actually be and live with them. And that is what he did. And he served them, I think, for 12 years before he himself got leprosy and finally died there. It was, Father Damien remains to me an enormous inspiration. And when I got into the IAS, my first posting was in a small town called Barwani in Madhya Pradesh. And I'd made many rules for myself. One of them was that if anyone comes to me in a delegation of any kind, I would go and sit among them and try to understand what they were demanding. And so one morning, a very strange, unusual demonstration came. There was a colony of leprosy patients living in absolutely the same kind of hellish conditions outside the city. And there was an unusual teacher who had made it his life's job to organize them, and whenever there was a new officer, he would bring them with very modest demands that we want a water point or we want a light somewhere. So, so they'd come and I sat with them, and when they began to speak, I said, no, let me come to where you live. And that's when a journey started, because I've met many people at the very margins of our society, but leprosy patients in many ways represented as far as you can go from hope, because they were battling the stigma and hatred of society. They were battling a disease that caused them, that they were frightened of with the deformities growing. But they were also abandoned by those closest to them. Spouses, parents, children would in fear abandon them. And so they were living this life of great loneliness. And I remember then I spoke to them. I used to keep going back, and I asked them that suppose you were able to give up begging, suppose you had work of dignity, would you give it up? And one of my most beautiful memories from that time is an entire skyline, actually, of people with stubs of fingers holding up their hands and saying, we all want to live a life of dignity. And so I tried to work with local people. We established a village for them called Ashagram. And after that, I was posted actually in many places in Chhattisgarh. And everywhere there were leprosy patients, the last generation of so-called burnt out cases. I used to spend my weekends with them. My Sunday morning was in the leprosy colony. And even now when I go back, if there's one place I have to go, it is to meet my friends in the leprosy colony. And in the course of that, I read a lot to try to understand. I remember reading Paul Brand's work, and that most profound, both medical but philosophical realization that God, if you believe in God, or nature, has given us the greatest gift of all, and that is the gift of pain. And it is because leprosy patients are deprived that gift of pain is why their bodies get damaged. And so in the course of trying to learn, I remember I began to think of CMC Vellore almost as a place of pilgrimage for a non-believing agnostic like me. And therefore I remember many years ago I had come once to CMC Vellore and visited the leprosy center almost as an act of privilege, of pilgrimage. And here I am so many years later once again. Let me speak of, I started off by saying we're living through very difficult times. In a recent book I wrote, the opening lines were that there are moments in human history when later generations are going to ask you, what did you do at that time? Germany in the 1930s was one such period. India and many parts of the world in the second decade of the 21st century is another such period. We're living in times where it is extremely dangerous to be two things. One of them is to be a minority of any kind, and the other is to be a dissenter of any kind. We're seeing leaders being elected, the world's two largest democracies, but also country after country in Europe and in many other parts of the world, Turkey, Russia, we're finding that people are electing a certain kind of leader. And the problem is not with those leaders, it is with us, because we are choosing leaders of a particular kind. And what characterizes the leaders that we seem more and more attracted to are because these are leaders whose very politics thrive on deeply divided societies. And another kind of leader is one who heals and bridges divides. We are choosing leaders who deepen and consolidate and widen divisions between people. We're choosing leaders who reflect in their politics bigotry and hatred. They reflect it, they amplify this, and they valorize it. And so that is a major part of the darkness of the times that we live in. But there's also enormous inequality. I believe that the world that we and the many young people here in the audience, the world that you in particular will leave behind for your children, will depend on how we as a people decide to deal with three principal challenges, I think, of our time. How we deal with inequality, how do we deal with difference, the fact that we are different, and how do we deal with climate change. And I will try to argue in the time that we have together that the core solution to each of these problems has to be built around what I describe as public compassion. But let me talk a little bit about these crises themselves. Inequality first. Just a few factoids. In the world today, 42 people, much less than the number of people in this auditorium, own as much wealth as half the population of the world. But in India, the numbers are even smaller. The number of people here and in the front row, 9 people own as much wealth as half of India's population. It's hard to imagine what these levels of wealth mean. Think of Bill Gates. Think that if Bill Gates decided that from today he's just not going to do anything except spend money, and he will spend $1 million every day. He won't invest his money anyway, it will just lie there and he'll keep spending $1 million every day. How long do you think his wealth would last? 218 years. It's hard to imagine a woman garment worker in Bangladesh spends her entire life struggling in extremely difficult circumstances, trying to keep her family together, working in this garment factory. How much time do you think the CEO of the fashion company, the top fashion brands in the world, how much the CEO of that would, how long he or she would take to earn as much as this garment worker would earn throughout her life? 4 days. It's difficult to imagine the scale of inequality in India and in the world. But in India, I think this inequality is scarring the entire world. But I think that in India, it is deepened and complicated by something else, and that is caste. Rohit Vemula, a very promising doctoral scholar, took his life a couple of years ago, 3 years ago actually. And he left a letter behind which was in itself, I think, one of the most painful indictments of everything that we have become and what we have not done. He said, whatever I did, I could not escape the fatal accident of my birth. And I think that for me, the idea of caste is ultimately the idea that it is legitimate for the accident of our birth to determine the rest of our life. The accident of our birth determines even whether I'll be allowed to live as a boy or a girl. It determines, in terms of my caste, it determines whether I'll get enough food, what kind of nutrition I'll get, where I'll live, whether I'll have clean water, sanitation. More importantly, whether I'll have any education at all, what kind of education, how far I'll be able to study, what jobs and livelihoods are open to me. None of this is determined by how hard I work, by the mettle of my character, the quality of my talents and capabilities, the flight of my dreams. It is determined primarily in India today still by the accident of our birth. And most of us in this room, myself included, don't deserve to be here. We are here because 1 billion people in this country did not get our life chances. So every time I pass, say, a young man working on a construction site, I wonder, looking at him, if he had my life chances, maybe he'd have been a great scientist. The woman, domestic helper in your home, she might have been actually a great neurosurgeon. Who knows? The boy serving tea at a dhaba could have been a great philosopher. We just have not allowed people the opportunities that some of us have only because of the accident of our birth.